Hey guys, Ashley Francis here, the holistic psychotherapist. So today I want to talk about negative self-talk and negative default programming. This is one of the subjects that is near and dear to my heart because it comes up very often in my practice with clients. And it can also be one of the things that is hardest to be able to understand and also to make real strides and make good progress in this area. So what I'd like to do is clear up some of the misconceptions and the ambiguity around negative self-talk and negative default programming so that we can really focus on trying to do things that help and that actually work. So we want to talk first about where it comes from. So let's identify what self-talk is. Self-talk is the naughty, dirty, awful, crazy, irrational things that we tell ourselves that are simply just not true. I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm never going to amount to anything, I'm permanently damaged, who do I think I am, why even bother, it's always my fault, the list goes on and on. So that's negative self-talk. The negative default programming takes this to a level deeper. So we want to understand by going back to childhood. When we were children, we were pure consciousness. We were blank slates. We were sponges to the environment and to the experiences around us. We're just soaking it up. We're just absorbing all of these interactions, all of the verbal cues, nonverbal cues from our caregivers, the interactions with our friends, rejection, acceptance, everything that we experience during childhood is getting absorbed into the subconscious, which later starts to translate to being there in consciousness as well. So if the child is being exposed to a negative experience, for example, a fight between their parents, the child has a tendency to internalize that as being their fault. And the reason for that is because children are egocentric, which basically means that their ego, their sense of self, has not been fully developed. So it's really hard for the child to be able to decipher what is my fault, when is it someone else's fault, when do I need to take responsibility, and when do other people need to take responsibility for what's happening here. This is not to say that every single time parents have a fight that the child is internalizing it. That's not necessarily the case, but what we're saying is that there is the propensity for that to happen, especially if it's happening often, over and over again, and the child is witness to it. Then they're definitely at a higher risk of developing a variety of negative self-thought, comments, talks, whatever it is. And that gets planted, and it's a seed that's planted at a young age. And a good way to conceptualize this is that it's like a filing folder. And that filing folder has the label on it that it's always my fault. So each time that child is being exposed to the fight between their parents, it's getting filed into that file folder with the label, it's always my fault. So you can imagine going across the lifespan, each time that child is experiencing something that is similar to that, he or she continues to internalize, it's always my fault. And it just gets filed away into that filing folder. So you can imagine by adulthood, that filing folder is big. It's fat. It is chock full of the I'm not good enough, so I'm not lovable, it's always my fault. And then it becomes definitively harder to be able to work through all of that. So it's really important to understand where all this came from, but most importantly, that it wasn't your fault. It is not the child's fault because they simply did not have the ability to be able to decipher what do I need to take responsibility for and what are other people responsible for. So that's our first step. The second is to acknowledge that this is an instinct. It's a survival instinct to have that negative self-talk or that negative default programming because it is an attempt to keep us alive. It is nothing more than an attempt to bring our attention to something that is either an actual threat or a perceived threat. And here's the interesting part, is that the mind does not know the difference between an actual threat and a perceived threat. That's right. The chemical reaction that happens in your brain when there is an actual threat versus a perceived threat is the same. It's ready to go. It's ready to fight or flight or freeze. It's primed and ready to go. But the point is that it's trying to get your attention so that you, in the event that you have to act, you're able to. If it is an instinct, then we can't do anything about it. And actually, it's there to serve us, to keep us safe, to save our own lives if we need to. But so what we need to do is be able to recognize that when that threat is there, we need to be able to decipher, is this an actual threat or is this a perceived threat? So the actual threat is something that could be a threat to your actual survival. It could be a rape or a potential murder or a natural disaster. So those are things that could actually kill us. But more often than not, the threat that the brain is receiving is a perceived threat. It's perceived. It could be when we feel rejected or not accepted by a group, when someone is calling us names or putting us down. That will activate the same parts in the brain that are equivalent to when we have an actual threat, and can therefore bring up actual emotions as if we might be dying. Crazy stuff, right? But that doesn't really serve us. It doesn't really function, because if we get stuck there, we're having this overreaction to something that doesn't even really exist. So the idea is to be able to acknowledge that this is a perceived threat, that I, in fact, am actually safe, and that my life is not in danger in any sort of way, real danger. So what we want to do next is we want to get some space between the stimulus that caused the threat reaction in the first place, so that we can allow ourselves the time and the space to be able to react appropriately. Another way of saying that is we need to remove ourselves from that threat, be able to engage in some breathing and some downtime to be able to regulate our emotions so that we can react appropriately. If you try to react, or you try to fix the problem while the stimulus is still there and while you are still activated, it's likely going to make things a lot worse. I'm sure you've experienced this before. So what we want to do is get some space between ourselves and that stimulus. And breathing is a really good idea, because what that is doing is an actual physical activity that we can do that calms the nervous system. And really what that is doing is it's helping to take the emotional part of the brain, tell it to calm down. It turns the volume down on the emotional part of the brain and helps to turn the volume up on the rational part of the brain, so that we can act in such a way that's in accordance with our own logic and what's best for us. When emotional parts of the brain are being lit up, that's really, really hard to do. In fact, I'd even venture to say that sometimes it's impossible for us to do that. So it's imperative, it's mandatory that we get a little bit of space between when that threat occurred and how we want to react. That's key. That's everything. The other thing that we also want to focus on is increasing the amount of positive influences in our lives. And the way that we do that is a 3-step process. So the first thing that we want to do is take an inventory of all the influences in our lives. We look at social media, we look at news, we look at peers, family, significant other, our environment, even the chemicals that we're being exposed to, believe it or not. First, we want to take an inventory of everything that's influencing us every single day. And then the second thing that we want to do is label it as mostly positive or mostly negative. Nothing is 100% positive, nothing is 100% negative. These things tend to, and sometimes it can fall in the middle, but typically they are either mostly positive or mostly negative. So you might even want to make a list of those things and journal about it. Maybe it's hard to figure out. I'm not really sure if this is mostly negative or mostly positive. So do a little reflection and trying to figure out how does your body feel when you're reflecting on that. And then once we've got the labels of what's mostly positive and mostly negative, we want to start reducing and or eliminating the things that are mostly negative, because they're not serving us. They're not doing us any good. An example would be exposure to the news. If you are exposed to the news for hours each day, check in with your body. What are your thoughts? What are your feelings? What are your bodily sensations that come up as you are listening to the news and absorbing that influence? More often than not, it's not a positive thing. So if that's the case, then we want to start reducing our exposure to the news so that we can free up that space Allow the emotional parts of our brain and our bodies to reduce, to allow the rational parts to come back online, and then we can go back to making decisions that are in our best interest. You'll notice that if we've been exposed to something negative all day long, it's going to bleed over into our reactions later that day in other reactions too. So that's another function as to why we want to do this, is it can clean up other areas of our life. So the final step is then to also increase our exposure to things that are positive. Get involved in groups that share common hobbies or interests of yours. Do some gratitude journaling. Talk about or just write about the things that you are grateful for, that you can put a positive spin on, that can bring your attention to the things that are working for you and also working for others. Also, you can volunteer. There is significant data out there that demonstrates that volunteering is one of the top things that we can do to help ourselves feel better, which sounds kind of self-serving, and I guess in a way that it is. But what's the harm if you are serving yourself while also serving others? I don't really see a downside to that. So it's really about nurturing a positive community so that we're having more positive experiences. And we're starting to create more default programming that is more positive as well. So that will do it for today's discussion on negative self-talk and negative default programming. I hope you enjoyed it. And I ask you to please subscribe to this video and like it and leave any comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say to keep the discussion going, as well as any other topics that you'd like to discuss. Take care.